On this Saturday night, a grim milestone. 500 days of fighting and sacrifice for Ukraine since the Russian invasion. We look at Ukraine's next moves to regain territory.
They need a boost, and this can provide that boost.
As Western nations prepare to discuss its request to join NATO. Hate on the rise, what's fueling this wave of attacks, and why it's more important than ever to report and track them. Saddling up in the switch from surviving to thriving.
And I think there's a little pent-up demand from our American friends.
And why challenges remain for Canada's tourism industry. Pulling on threads, what a lawsuit against Meta's so-called Twitter killer app signals.
Global National with Farah Nasser reporting tonight, and Gaviola.
Good evening, and thanks for joining us. We begin with the war in Ukraine, which has reached another somber milestone. It's now been 500 days since Russia invaded the country. Since February 24th of last year, there have been 25,170 civilian casualties. That includes more than 9,000 killed and more than 15,000 injured. Military casualties on both sides are difficult to establish and verify. More than 6 million Ukrainians have become refugees since the start of the war. And there is no end in sight to the fighting, which has left some families forced to say goodbye to their loved ones and others picking up the pieces of a life shattered by conflict. Mackenzie Gray reports.
It's an all too common scene after 500 days of war. At least 10 dead in western Ukraine after a Russian missile landed in a residential area of Lviv. For those who survive, there's often nothing left to come home to. That's exactly what happened to the Zertisky family, who fled Kyiv after their house burned down, now calling the Ukrainian countryside home. Olga forced to cook outdoors for her family of 5, while her husband Igor watches their children in a tiny wooden home. President Volodymyr Zelensky paying tribute to millions of Ukrainians who've sacrificed during the war on a visit to Snake Island, a tiny village in the Black Sea the Ukrainians were able to retake from the Russians. The potential to regain more territory got a boost, with Joe Biden announcing the U.S. would deliver cluster bombs to Kyiv. They're a controversial weapon that releases a large number of smaller bomblets that can kill indiscriminately over a wide area, but those that don't explode pose a long-term threat.
Depending on how they land, some of them don't go off and will hang around, and that number is anywhere from 2% on up, depending on the terrain, and civilians can happen upon these.
They're a weapon Canada and many other Western allies have banned.
The UK is signatory to a convention which prohibits the production or use of cluster munitions and discourages their use.
Western countries are also split on Ukraine's request to join NATO. But on Friday, Zelensky was able to get an unexpected endorsement when Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan said Ukraine undoubtedly deserves to be a member of the alliance, a step the White House is uneasy of.
The United States, our NATO allies in Ukraine, will have the opportunity to discuss the reforms that are still necessary for Ukraine to come up to NATO standards.
That conversation will likely intensify next week when leaders from all 31 NATO countries will meet in Lithuania. But as it stands now, Anne, Zelensky's not expected to attend that conference.
And that is Mackenzie Gray in Ottawa. Thank you. And on this 500th day of war, a homecoming for heroes. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky greeting 5 commanders in Istanbul. They were forced to live in Turkey under the terms of a prisoner exchange. The commanders led last year's defense of the port in Mariupol. Zelensky gave no explanation for why the commanders were being allowed to return home now. And there is movement on the push for a public inquiry into foreign interference in Canada. The Conservatives say an agreement has been reached on terms for the probe, stating all parties have shared their suggested names for a potential commissioner. The deal has yet to be confirmed by the Trudeau government. It appears to break the impasse between the Liberals and Conservatives about how to establish an inquiry into foreign interference in Canada's federal elections. And police in Ottawa are sounding the alarm over a significant rise in hate crimes in that city. Since January, there have been more than 200 hate-motivated incidents. As Easton Hamm reports, it's an alarming trend being seen right across the country.
Volunteers of different faiths and backgrounds came together in Vancouver today to restore 7 pride doors that had been vandalized at a church on the city's west side.
The message of today is determination against hate in the world, and we repaint, repaint, and repaint.
It's a show of unity. After repeated hate crimes, police saying this was the 3rd time in as many years the church was targeted.
It's annoying. Worse than that, it is a horrific message to the 2S LGBTQA community.
Unfortunately, they're not alone. Just this week, a man in Kelowna was caught jumping to rip a pride flag hanging from an art gallery. Anti-Semitic pamphlets were distributed in the city of Peterborough, and in Ottawa, 221 hate-motivated incidents were reported in the first half of 2023.
I mean, we're 6 months in, so it's around 35 files a month that are coming into our office.
That's nearly a 24% jump from the same time last year.
The diverse communities and the 2S LGBTQIA+ community that is being affected by this, it's concerning to them.
The executive director of Pride Toronto telling Global News it's time for leaders to act.
We call on all 3 levels of government to hold folks accountable. There is no room. We can no longer sit by and just allow that level of hate to the 2S LGBTQ community continue.
Experts say motivated incidents are on the rise right across the country.
What we're seeing is that over the last 10 years, it's hate crime in Canada, reported hate crime, has doubled.
Doug King says misinformation during the pandemic could be partly to blame, but adds there's still a large amount of hate crimes that go unreported.
So what was kind of fueling that was largely the conspiracy theories that were being floated around on social networks.
As numbers grow, the message from those cleaning up these instances of hate remain the same. This community will not quit.
Well, it's just the constant proof that love wins and that the darkness will not overcome.
Easton Hamm, Global News.
And it is the first weekend of the Calgary Stampede, and for the first time since the pandemic, international visitors seem eager to come back to the 10-day event. Early ticket sales have surpassed 2019 levels, with American and European tourists helping to drive numbers up. With international borders free of pandemic restrictions this summer, there's hope the tourism sector is finally on the rebound. Heather Urex-West reports.
In Alberta, summer doesn't truly start until there's a parade. In a normal year, the Calgary Stampede draws about 1 million visitors to the city, and with them, a whole lot of spending.
Let's look at it by the numbers. $8 billion comes to Alberta every year for tourism. The Stampede alone is $500 million.
There we go! Of course, things haven't been normal for the tourism sector since 2019. While last summer saw signature events stage comebacks, many international visitors stayed away.
Last year, of course, we still had restrictions at the border with regard to vaccination requirements. This year, there are no such restrictions, and I think there's a little pent-up demand from our American friends because they're coming back.
The Stampede isn't expecting to break attendance records this year, but it is hoping to see the kind of numbers it saw pre-pandemic. A path Canada's tourism industry as a whole is tracking towards as well.
We're a year earlier than we thought we would be in the recovery. We're at 93% of 2019 levels, and we fully expect to be at 2019 levels. That was our best tourism year on record by the end of 23.
Finding workers to support all these good times continues to be a challenge. According to the Tourism Industry Association of Canada, heading into the summer, the national tourism workforce was short nearly 100,000 people.
It's great to see this Stampede, all the tents were able to fill up, all their positions. But labor in the province has been tough, Bow Valley area especially.
In the mountain resort communities west of Calgary, 0% housing vacancy has made hiring especially hard. The problem compounded over the Canada Day long weekend when a Lake Louise staff residence housing hundreds of workers went up in flames. The federal tourism minister says building affordable housing in these communities is priority 1.
So it means working with the municipalities to figure out how we can open up the land with the municipalities to build more housing. Full stop. It needs to be social housing, affordable housing, and attainable housing, and that's what the National Housing Strategy is for.
as the industry looks to rebound and grow in the coming years after several seasons in survival and recovery mode. Heather Yurex, West Global News, Calgary.
And it's a political flip-off of sorts on day 2 of the Stampede. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau showed off some skill on the grill, flipping flapjacks this morning at the Ismaili pancake breakfast. Not to be outdone by opposition leader Pierre Poilievre. The born and raised Calgarian also made an appearance at one of the many Stampede breakfasts around town, alongside Alberta Premier Danielle Smith. And the cost of borrowing is set to become even more expensive. Coming up, a growing chorus of economists warn household budgets should brace for another interest rate hike. Canada's labour market continues to churn out jobs, providing momentum for a growing consensus among economists who expect a small rate hike on Wednesday. Now, all 6 of Canada's biggest commercial banks expect a 0.25 percentage point increase to the Bank of Canada's key interest rate. The latest snapshot of the expanding job market shows the creation of 60,000 positions in June, even as the jobless rate ticked higher. That's because immigration increased the size of the job market and also pushed up the number of people looking for a job. Joining me to discuss is Nate Thuft with Manulife Investment Management. Welcome.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Nate, we are finally seeing signs that the Canadian economy is slowing. Inflation has eased, the job market's still strong, but wage growth has slowed. Could we achieve that elusive soft landing and dodge a recession?
I mean, there's a theoretical reason that you could, but I think the risk is still pretty high that we do see a period of outright recession or simply slow growth. And the reality is there isn't much difference between that. There's still going to be a level of pain felt by a lot of consumers and a lot of the general public based on the higher rates that we've seen the central bank raise over the last year or so. And the simple reality is a lot of that pain is probably still yet to come in the markets.
Okay, so not the greatest news there. The Bank of Canada's next interest rate announcement is Wednesday. Money markets are betting on a 25 basis point increase. Of all the economists I've interviewed this week, only one expects our central bank to pause. What do you see in your crystal ball?
Unfortunately, our base case is we too do see a 25 basis point hike. Now, whether it's the right thing to do or not is a question, because as I said earlier, there's a lot of the increase in rates that has still yet to be felt by the markets and the overall economy. There's a big lag, and the 0.25 point probably doesn't mean a lot in the grand scheme of things because it's just another 25 basis points on the 400 to 500 they've already raised. But, it is something that they're sticking to the theme that they must squash inflation, and their rhetoric has been very clear that they're focused on that, and therefore we do expect another 0.25 point this coming week.
Okay, and the Bank of Canada, we know it started its aggressive rate hiking cycle last March. Historically, it takes about 18 months for increases to be fully felt throughout the economy. We are seeing signs that they're working, but in many ways, this is just the tip of the iceberg. I'm thinking of those mortgages that will be up for renewal. Is there a danger in keeping interest rates at the highest levels we've seen in a generation?
There's an absolute danger, and I think that's the balancing act that the federal government as well as the central bank is going to have to do relative to the impacts to the economy. We know there's a lot more to come through from these rate hikes that we haven't seen in everyday life, and the mortgage area is one in particular in Canada that's quite unique relative to other geographies around the globe, and that pain is still to come in many cases. But at the same time, they're focused on the broader inflation story, and inflation is a complex topic. There's lots of areas of inflation that are still arguably running too strong beyond just the idea that your interest rate costs and your mortgage costs are going up. They're looking at the whole picture of inflation, and there is more work to do to get to the ballpark that they're focused on.
Yeah, not a ton of time left, but I do want to ask you, so we know interest rates are the tool that the Bank of Canada has to tackle inflation, but there are other factors that could dampen inflation and economic growth. For example, a prolonged strike at BC ports. Also, immigration tends to have a dampening effect on wages and inflation. How much of an impact do you think those internal factors can have?
Oh, there's a lot of impacts. Inflation is a very complex story because there are a lot of drivers of inflation that are still at play. At the same time, some of those drivers are starting to see a level of alleviation, such as supply chain issues. But at the same time, as you noted, there's a lot of external factors that are still at play. So what the central bank is doing is only one component of the fight against inflation. And in many cases, their fight against inflation doesn't actually solve all the inflation story. And so there is a multifaceted approach here that has to be taken to truly solve the challenge of controlling inflation in the coming years.
We'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time and your insight. That was Nate Thuft of Manulife Investment Management. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Life imitates art. Ahead, how a former spy is using his experience to create incredibly detailed prosthetics. When someone is visibly disfigured by a traumatic accident or birth defect, there can be a constant barrage of awkward stares and questions. But for some, that all changed after meeting an expert in the field of disguises. In a story originally featured on the new reality, Jackson Prosco introduces us to a former spy who's embarked on a new mission.
These are the hands of an artist, a man whose work is so detailed and so precise, you'd think it's real. And that's the point, because Robert Barron's art imitates life.
That looks like skin, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. I mastered the technique of making silicone look like skin.
From his small lab near Washington, D.C., Robert crafts prosthetics that are so realistic, injuries and genetic deformities become invisible. For Robert's patients, it's life-changing. Steve Butler traveled here from West Virginia. Cancer took his ear and much of the surrounding tissue from his neck and face. Today, he's getting the first fitting of the complex silicone prosthetic Robert has been crafting.
I don't even feel it on there. It's light, very light.
But this is just the beginning. Robert will now spend hours doing what no one else can, tinting the ear and skin flap in meticulous detail so that it perfectly blends in with Steve's skin. Tomorrow, Steve will see and wear his finished prosthetic for the very first time.
It's a great psychological benefit in their mental, physical, and social well-being. When I get up in the morning, I know when I go to work, I'm going to make a difference in someone's life.
Some artists want fame, but Robert is not a typical creator. He built his reputation in a place where success means nobody recognizes your work. That's because he honed his skills as a real-life master of disguise at the CIA and eventually developed full-face silicone masks that were flawless. Robert's work allowed American operatives to completely change their appearance, even their ethnicity, in an instant.
They could put it on in 3 seconds.
3 seconds?
And take it off in 3 seconds.
A complete face?
Yes, absolutely.
That sounds like something out of Mission Impossible.
How about Mission Possible?
Later, he studied under biomedical sculptors who exposed him to the reality of a hidden world. A world of people who were tragically disfigured. Just like the spies, these people wanted to move through life without attracting attention. Suddenly, Robert had a plan for life after the CIA.
And the light went on. And I said to myself, if you can put people in hiding, you can bring people out of hiding.
And when Steve Butler returned for his next appointment, Robert made a few final touches. And then it was Steve's turn to take a look in the mirror.
It's just incredible. Unbelievable.
After a career devoted to remarkable artistry, he knows someone's life depends on his next invisible masterpiece.
Jackson Prosco, Global News.
Twitter versus Threads. Next, the battle between the social media rivals heats up. Since Meta's Threads launched Wednesday, it has become one of the most rapidly downloaded apps, now surpassing 80 million users. It's targeting those wanting alternatives to Twitter after some unfavorable changes to the platform. Now Twitter is threatening legal action, accusing its rival of being a copycat. Mike Toghrol reports.
Watch any sidewalk for a few minutes, and without a doubt, you'll come across a social media zombie. In other words, the prize eyeballs in a digital cage fight between Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg. And man, it's getting good.
I don't know if there's room for another social media app right now, but I think Twitter's had its day. Elon Musk has completely ruined Twitter.
When it comes to social media, Twitter is still king, with over 230 million users. Others have tried to take market share, but none of Mastodon, Truth Social, or Blue Sky have made much of a dent, even with Musk's habit of posting polarizing right-wing tweets.
I'll say what I want to say, and if the consequence of that is losing money, so be it.
But now there's a new contender in the ring, Threads, created by Meta founder Zuckerberg. The app was released on Thursday and is growing by millions of new users daily, enough to get Musk's attention. Musk tweeted that competition is fine, cheating is not, and his lawyers have threatened to sue for hiring former Twitter employees who have access to trade secrets.
It's so early that it's hard to say what Zuckerberg's vision for Threads is. Is it just to simply take market share from Twitter in a very opportunistic time? That would be my guess.
YouTuber Mr. Beast seems to have picked a side, cheekily offering to give away a Tesla with a Threads logo to one of his followers to celebrate the new platform. Not that the billionaires need help trading barbs. In fact, they almost ended up in a literal cage match after it became known Zuckerberg was learning to fight. Musk went so far as to suggest a location, Vegas Octagon, before the whole thing fell apart. What a shame. But I guess a pair of tech geniuses not known for their social skills publicly fighting for social media supremacy is a decent enough undercard. Mike Toghrol, Global News.
And that is Global National for this Saturday night. I'm Ann Gaviola. Tonight's Your Canada is North Sydney, Nova Scotia. We love seeing your Canada. Please keep emailing your photos to viewers@globalnational.com. Thank you for watching. Jeff Semple will be back at the anchor desk tomorrow. Have a great night.